So, good morning, everybody. In today's class, we're going to take a look at international relations and the mid to late 1900s. So, moving forward, the itinerary for today is to look at Britain and the First World War, Second World War, and also the aftermath. And we begin here with World War I. I was just introducing the kind of movement towards it at the end of the 19th century, though people in Europe did not grasp that that was happening. Mentioned this idea previously, Pax Britannica, which was a period of relative peace, not total peace, but relative peace in Europe after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, overseen to a degree by Britain as a superpower state. But within that, you also had growing alliance systems that developed, which would become instrumental in the outbreak of war. You had a triple alliance system between Germany, Austria-Hungary, a hybrid country, and Italy. And as a response, the Triple Entente, 1907, Britain, France, and Russia. So even at this point, you already had Europe divided into these different camps, founded on these alliance systems, and this would indeed become the First World War. These two alliances pitted against one another. There were precursors to World War I, Boer War, which was fought in South Africa between the Boers or Afrikaners, Dutch South Africans, and the British. The Russo-Japanese War as well, war that was won by the Japanese, which quickly undermined any kind of narrative of European supremacy, but those were shorter, contained wars, whereas the First World War spilled over into this apocalyptic struggle. The triggering event was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, heir to the throne in Austria-Hungary, but there was a big lead up to that particular event taking place. You might ask the question, what does this assassination have to do with a country like Britain? Well, on the one hand, very little, but on the other hand, a lot when you look at the backstory. That was the triggering event, but there were two main causes of the war. I've already mentioned one of them previously, nationalism, but also imperialism as well. Talked extensively about imperialism last time, but growing nationalism in a sense of national unity, which did not exist as such, or did not really exist in the form we think of it today prior to the 19th century, because countries were really not consolidated enough or unified enough to really provoke that sense of a strong national ideal. So that was in some respect a 19th century creation, the idea of nationalism. So there is the event depicted there, Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, assassinated by a Bosnian Serb nationalist on that day, June 28th, 1914. This assassination had to do with events that were occurring in the Balkans in 1914, just to give a sense of context. The decline of the old Ottoman Empire, which I mentioned previously, a country that corresponds to modern Turkey, had left something of a power vacuum in what they call the Balkans, consisting of countries that still exist to this day in some form or another, such as Bulgaria, Albania, Serbia, and others. But the power aspirations and territorial ambitions of two large countries were provoking this conflict. Both Austria and Hungary and Russia had interests in the Balkans. That's why it was basically the action of a Serb nationalist sort of attack against this larger imperialist state, against the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. That was the relevance to that. It was basically nationalistic aspirations that existed in the Balkan states against imperialist powers in Europe. The question, of course, of what did this really have to do with Britain? How would this lead to the outbreak of war? Well, we have to understand the larger situation in Europe at the time. I mentioned previously this thing about Europe as a whole, where you have, thanks to the topography and the history, a lot of small nations clustered close together, which had provoked intensive competition between them, which might have played a role in capitalism taking hold in Europe. But that competition had certainly not abated. In fact, it had intensified as industrialization came to other European nation states. Mentioned previously that it came to Britain first. Britain was the first country to experience industrialization, but other countries, such as Germany and France, were catching up. Unification of Germany into a single state, which didn't happen until the 1800s, had also created this growing tension and suspicion and hostility between the countries. They were fighting over imperialist territories, including in Africa. Remember the scramble for Africa I mentioned previously, but also fighting over their own particular territories within Europe. There you see this caricature map that appeared in 1914. Germany and Austria-Hungary point their weapons at the looming face of Russia. This image of this face of Russia kind of encroaching or creeping ever further into Central Europe. Germany is also trying to stomp down France. Italy, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire look on in alarm. So Britain's involvement in the war, well, the conflict in the end, thanks to the assassination of the Archduke, ended up being between Russia and Austria-Hungary. That was where the struggle over this assassination, what this event meant and how it was going to be framed, occurred. But keep in mind, Austria-Hungary is allied with Germany, Russia is allied with France and Britain. Thus, the conflict between these two major nation states ends up dragging in other countries into this cyclonic vortex, and that's what triggers this larger war. The outbreak of the war was greeted with mass jubilation and enthusiasm because it played into larger nationalistic sentiments at the time. What better way to prove the prowess of an individual nation state than in the theater of war, and thus there were celebrations and these big marches. The expectation was that the war would be quite brief, that would end by Christmas of that year, and that was also part of the nationalistic sentiment at the time, the idea that one's own country was assured a quick victory, just because it is your own country, so you're convinced that it's the best and superior. Doesn't work if everyone has that perspective, of course, but also it was a kind of misunderstanding of what this war was going to entail. I mentioned this also last time. The authorities, ruling figures, failing to grasp the impact of industrialization, the all-encompassing impact of industrialization, and the way that industrialization was going to change the face of modern warfare. The soldiers who entered the war in 1914 were not prepared for modern warfare. They were expecting to fight something like a 19th century war. They had cloth caps, for instance, instead of steel helmets. They were approaching battle tactics without really taking into account the game-changing power of the machine gun. Modern machine gun, which can mow down, can kill people, hundreds of people very quickly. They were not equipped with gas masks, even though poison gas, chlorine gas, and mustard gas would become instrumental in the war. So they entered into the war not really comprehending what it was really going to entail. Well, what did it entail? A kind of a massive, gruesome war of attrition. That's essentially what unfolded. Mass slaughter, mass destruction in very rapid order, short periods of time. The war expected to end by Christmas, but by Christmas, 450,000 soldiers were already dead, including 90,000 soldiers from Britain. That was more than the total number initially recruited. So the number of people they recruited initially had already been killed by the time they got to Christmas. And not only that, but there was no end in sight, would be no end in sight for years to come. The Western Front, that is this purple line that runs through Belgium and France, became fixed and entrenched and barely changed throughout the course of the war. There was just a stalemate on both sides, with neither side able to achieve a breakthrough. The Eastern Front proved to be more flexible and mobile, partly because that's a lot more territory, and also partly because of a revolution that would ultimately come to Russia. The war bogged down into trench warfare, with these soldiers living in these mud dugouts, these trenches, which were rudimentary at first, became more sophisticated over time, or sophisticated as a trench can ever be. And they were basically living in appalling, atrocious conditions, these mud dugouts infested with lice, with rats, hotbeds for the spread of disease with minimal care, support, medical treatment. There you see some of the depictions of these soldiers in trench conditions, including those blinded by poison gas at the top. And the war, as this battle of attrition, just seemed to become more and more about throwing as many soldiers, as many men at each other, and they seem to be completely expendable, at least from the perspective of the authorities. You seem to get the impression that these people, who had been cheap labor previously, there had been all the individuals working in factories, well, now they were expendable labor on the battlefields, human life less valuable than the equipment and the weapons that they were using. The return of the repressed. There you see a German magazine's depiction of the earth in the year 1916 soaked with blood. 1960, one of the most bloodiest, destructive years of the entire war. And I say the return of the repressed because this seemed to be the return of imperialism and the imperialist project to Europe. Said before that the imperialist project was always a commercial venture, but it had also been a bloody, destructive venture as well, with wars and battles fought against native inhabitants in various countries or against other European countries. All that violence had been visited around the world and brought to other countries. Well, now it was here in Europe as well. And in a way, it was an exposure of what imperialism had been all along. I mean, Britain could say that imperialism had been about bringing their culture and their civilization to other nations. But you look at the First World War, and the question that I think should rise is, why would any country want this culture and this civilization where thousands or millions of people, as it ended up being, would be fighting against each other? Their lives are expendable. They live in trenches. Horrible, destructive life. This is the civilization that we're bringing around the world. This is what we're introducing to other people around the world. Exposes imperialism for what it actually was all along. There was, of course, a dissidence at the time, but voices drowned out, as is often the case, under this kind of warmongering mass hysteria, founded on fear, founded on outrage, founded on hatred, those kind of base emotions that steamroll over critical thought or reflection. And these voices of people who speak out against it often just drowned out. Albert Einstein, one of those individuals, probably the most famous scientist in history, well, him and Newton. Europe, in its madness, has embarked on something incredibly preposterous. At such times, one sees to what deplorable breed of brutes we belong. The authorities were not eager to bring the war to a close, except with something approaching total victory. And this mass drive towards total victory ironically ensured that total victory was basically impossible, destroying themselves as well as the enemy. There you see some typical propaganda posters promoting the continuation of the war as well as the participation of basically the entire population. I mean, that's what it ended up becoming, not just the young men participating on the front lines, but women working in factories, building munitions and weapons, and just everyone kind of marshaled into the war effort. America, the United States, incidentally, did not enter the war right away, although they were allied with Britain. It only was a series of events leading up to 1917 that brought the United States into the war. But America, very importantly, did bankroll the war through loans that they offered to France and Britain. They were absolutely central to the funding campaign for the Triple Entente. And when the war finally did end in November of 1918, there you see some of the numbers that we're talking about in terms of soldiers mobilized and also those who were killed in action, wounded, went missing. Look at the total casualties. That basically encompasses not just people who were killed, but also those who were wounded. Look at the percentages over here. In Russia, 76% of the people who fought in the war were casualties of the war. Astronomically high number. Go down there to look at Austria-Hungary. 90% of the people who fought on the side of Austria-Hungary were casualties in the war. And of course, you note the numbers at the bottom. 8.5 million people killed in this war. Nothing like that had ever occurred in human history. There had never been anything on the scale of total warfare, and certainly nothing like industrial warfare. And there was this sense of bewilderment, a total unexpected development for everyone who had started this war that they'd assumed would end quickly. There were really no end to the consequences to it either. In 1918, a devastating influenza epidemic known colloquially as the Spanish flu broke out, and it became this global pandemic. That was something that was a little bit forgotten to history until COVID. Then it kind of returned a little bit because people made that comparison difficult to know for certain, but anywhere between 50 and 100 million people might have died in this pandemic one way or another. And we could say, well, did the First World War have an influence on the spread of the Spanish flu? Yes, absolutely, it had an influence on that because, again, trenches, hotbeds for the spread of disease and infection. In war, you have a lot more mobility, people moving from one place to the next, and also medical facilities and hospitals are always overstrained during wartime because there's so much treatment of prisoners going on. So a factor, this ripple knock-on effect of this global pandemic connected to the war. You could say that there were heroes in the war. That, of course, includes the rank-and-file anonymous soldiers who were thrown into battle, many of them with really no inclination of why this war was even being fought or why it would have to continue. But there were also people as well who protested or resisted the war effort in the individual countries and ultimately took steps to overthrow the governments of the regimes that were perpetuating this war. That kind of revolutionary action, I think, seems justified in this case. The revolutions were very important to actually bringing the war to an end. Revolution in Russia and Germany. There you see a major riot in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, Russia in 1917. Growing dissidents in Russia took Russia out of the war, actually. There you see the aftermath of a food riot in Berlin, Germany in 1918. Series of food shortages hitting the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary and Germany was an important factor in bringing the war to an end. Loss of morale among the people at home. When we came to the end of the war, the borders, the map of Europe had basically been redrawn. A completely cataclysmic event. There you see the borders of Europe. Prior to the war, well, this kind of model just kind of spiraling down into the abyss. You had 4 of the countries that participated in the war did not exist as such by the end of the war. The German Empire had been restyled, no longer this monarchical regime, but a different country. Austria-Hungary did not exist as such anymore, broken apart into different nation states, which has been the case ever since. The Ottoman Empire restyled as Turkey, but the biggest change of all was in the east, where the Russian Empire was gone, that absolute monarchy that had existed previously, and in its place to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the first communist regime in history. It was actually the revolution that took Russia out of the war, and this was actually a 2-part event. In February of 1917, the monarchical government of Russia collapsed, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. It was the Tsar, the monarch of the Russian absolute monarchy, and control passed to a provisional government. The provisional government was actually interested in introducing democracy into Russia, thus drew a lot of international support. However, this was a kind of interrupted process because in October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin's extremist Marxist-inspired Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and formed a communist state ostensibly devoted to the complete destruction of the world capitalist system. Communist state became known not just as a state that wanted to resist a particular political system that existed in this one country, but actually was devoted to the idea of overthrowing an entire material paradigm. I don't think something like that had happened previously in history either. The kind of awareness of this idea of different material paradigms, the difference between feudalism and capitalism, and no longer seeing them as these eternal social orders, but rather as these frameworks that people and civilizations pass through over time. So then when they come to power, there's this idea that we're actually going to overturn the entire system that encompasses the world. That was the original goal of the Bolsheviks and communists in Russia, was to inspire an international revolution to encompass Europe and even the world as a whole. Kind of ideology here owes a lot to Karl Marx and also to this person, G.W.F. Hegel, who was someone who influenced Marx a lot. He was a great system builder of Enlightenment thought, and he crystallized the methodology of dialectics, constructed narratives of human history and intellectual knowledge. One of the kind of important things there, he identified freedom as the most important force, the driving force in the development of culture and civilization. That's essentially what human culture is tending towards, what people are striving towards, is this ideal, this principle of greater and increasing freedom, which is an interesting principle to think about in the contemporary context. And this idea of dialectics, understanding history as basically a dynamic interaction of opposites. That's essentially what dialectics means. Marx takes this methodology and applies it to social, political, and economic history, arguing that socio-political systems evolve through opposition and contradiction. And this is the kind of starting point for thinking about the communist ideology, but also just as a framework of history. We have to pause a little bit to think about some of the implications of his argument. This notion of opposition and contradiction. A Marxist approach might look at feudalism and say that there's a basic contradiction at the heart of the feudal social order. This is a social order that divides people along apparently inherent lines. Says that the king is intrinsically a different person than a peasant, and a peasant is inherently a different person than a duke, and that these different hierarchical orderings are all natural. They're basically God's will. And thus, that is the reason why you just have a small group of people who own everything, who have all the wealth. You have a monarch, and you have members of the aristocracy, and they own everything because they are intrinsically different people from everyone else. Well, the Marxist interpretation would say, well, isn't it kind of the opposite? Isn't it the fact that you just have a tiny group of people, this little cabal, and because they own all the wealth and they have all the power, they rule over this social order that basically says nobody else can have what we have. Nobody else is entitled to break into our realm. So it's really the acquisition of wealth and power which determines the social order, not God's will or some kind of automatic difference between people. That's the kind of inner contradiction of feudalism. Marx would say the contradiction is the truth of the feudal social order. It's the inner reality of that system. And it's a truth that cannot be contained. It can't be repressed. Rather, it grows and expands over time until it gives birth to a different system. Capitalism, where explicitly, overtly, it's the case that power in society, status in society, is coordinated with wealth, acquisition of land, ownership of things. So that's the kind of social order that Marx envisioned, and that's precisely what the communists attempted to implement. Interesting point in history when we get to 1917, the idea of this mass mobilization of people and what governments are capable of, what political leaders are capable of. Here's something I also mentioned last time. We reach a certain point in industrialization where there's a lot more in the way of infrastructure, mass communication, mass transportation, and you have the ability to start a war where you mobilize, in the end, literally millions of people, as though it's this giant ant farm. Not possible in previous eras. You just don't have the technology and infrastructure to do that kind of thing. You do have armies, but you can't mobilize an entire population. Well, insofar as that's the case, might it not also be the case that we can kind of grab hold of the reins of history and actually bring about a transition to a different material paradigm? Not just introduce a new political system or a new leader, but an entire new social order. This is basically what the communists have in mind, the idea of now we have the ability to control the full-scale global development of history in this giant top-down way. And thus, the communist Vladimir Lenin had this intention of taking us out of capitalism and into socialism, into the next stage of human history. You see the basic Marxist chart of the different material paradigms succeeding one after another. As I say, part of what is startling about the early 20th century is the way certain individuals not only anticipated a transition out of capitalism, but also attempted to bring it about, actually tried to make that happen. And we'll take a little look at the degree to which they succeeded or did not succeed a little bit later. Implications of the war for individual people. Well, here's George Orwell speaking about it. He writes in a first-person narrative. This is not him personally, but a character he creates, an individual who grows up in a small country town in England, basically has just modest ambitions of running a grocery. He's living that small-town life and is in many respects sees himself as a normal, anonymous person. And then the war breaks out, and he's brought into the front lines of the war, the trenches. And here he is describing the effect that the war had on him. He was wounded, but not seriously, so he survives, wasn't killed, but nonetheless, the psychological impact of the war. It was like an enormous machine that had got hold of you. You had no sense of acting of your own free will, and at the same time, no notion of trying to resist. If people didn't have some such feeling as that, no war could last 3 months. The armies would just pack up and go home. Why had I joined the army? Or the million other idiots who joined up before conscription came in? Partly for a lark, and partly because of England, my England, and Britain's never, never, and all that stuff. That's a reference to Rule Britannia, this patriotic song. But how long did that last? The machine had got hold of you, and it could do what it liked with you. It lifted you up and dumped you down among places and things you'd never dreamed of. And if it had dumped you down on the surface of the moon, it wouldn't have seemed particularly strange. The day I joined the army, the old life was finished. Speaking there about an entire kind of cultural ethos formed and sculpted in the 19th century. It would be an exaggeration to say that the war turned people into highbrows, but it did turn them into nihilists for the time being. Nihilists, someone who basically doesn't believe anything, just regards life as being absurd and meaningless at its core. People who in a normal way would have gone through life with about as much tendency to think for themselves as a suet pudding were turned into bolshies just by the war. A bolshi's a Bolshevik. What should I be now if it hadn't been for the war? I don't know, but something different from what I am. If the war didn't happen to kill you, it's bound to start you thinking. After that unspeakable, idiotic mess, you couldn't go on regarding society as something eternal and unquestionable like a pyramid. You knew it was just a balls up. So the idea of no longer even seeing the social order as being anything fixed and stable anymore. Let's take a look at the aftermath of World War I and the road to World War II. As I say, no end to the consequences of the First World War because it basically created the Second World War. Take a look at the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called war guilt clause, reparations weakening an enemy, and the stock market crash of 1929, which started the Great Depression, which lasted for 10 years, basically across the 1930s. The powers to be, the people who started the war, apparently learned nothing from the experience. How else to explain the ruinous Treaty of Versailles? This was basically the treaty that brought the war to an end, kind of brought the war to an end before the Central Powers collapsed completely. The war was basically already won by that point, insofar as you could call a war that had such cataclysmic effects being won. But the Treaty of Versailles was basically the peace agreement. It is best remembered for the so-called war guilt clause, which blamed Germany and its allies for starting the war. This was basically blamed for Germany because the rest of Germany's allies didn't really exist in the same form anymore. And the war guilt clause was definitely one of those things that was written by and for the victors. It was total rubbish. Yes, Germany had been responsible for starting the war, but also Britain had been responsible, and France, and Russia, and Italy, Ottoman Empire. Every country that participated in that war was equally culpable, equally responsible for starting that war. The War Guilt Clause was a justification for imposing reparations onto Germany, which basically meant that they were going to have to pay the winning countries for the damage that they had caused during the war, particularly France, because that's when most of the war had been fought. Insofar as there was any real logic to this, it was based on the principle of weakening an enemy. Basically, the idea there is that the best way to prevent another war happening in the future is to decimate your enemy, to make them as weak as possible, to make them dependent on you, to saddle them with debts that they cannot pay, and to basically destroy their infrastructure. I mean, that's the kind of underlying logic of that idea. Can't happen, doesn't work. You can't go back in history. Germany had already experienced the Industrial Revolution. It had become a modern state. Indeed, it experienced imperialism, nationalism, militarism. So all this was really going to do was create a discontent in Germany and malaise and weakened social conditions, which is effectively what happened. Even the kind of practical policy of trying to gain money or reparations payments for this proved to be misguided. The war debts and the reparations payments enforced on Germany set at 132 billion gold marks. That's about 33 billion US in equivalent money. This basically just caused hyperinflation in Germany. And here's something that I mentioned last time. The whole process of printing money in order to pay off a debt. This is something that we see in the modern era, except they don't even bother printing money anymore. You can just do it on a computer. That's what Germany essentially did. We need all this money. We don't have all this money. Okay, go to the central banks, fire up the printing presses, and just create the money. Create the money out of nothing and use that to help pay off the debt. And that caused hyperinflation. All the currency loses money. You can see the astronomical increase in the inflation over this period. It got to the point where individuals were using the money to paper their walls because it's not worth anything. The money itself is not actually worth anything. There was something of a recovery in Germany, indeed the rest of Europe, in the late 1920s, but cruelly interrupted by an event that happened in America, which would be very important in the lead up to the Second World War. There was an American boom in car steel production and construction, which fueled a barrage of risky investments on Wall Street, and the system crashed in October of 1929 through a rush of panic selling. This was a kind of boom era in the United States, and it speaks to something quite important, namely that America had become the center for manufacturing in the world. This was a process that was already starting to occur in the late 19th century, and it really accelerated during the course of the First World War. America was the only country that really prospered during the First World War, namely because they stayed out of it for a long time. And they also were financing, bankrolling the war. And they continued with that momentum into the 1920s. It was a kind of a boom era in America, but also created a lot of volatility and instability in the stock market. The stock market crash in America and the subsequent depression conditions had this huge ripple effect across Europe. But they didn't even really anticipate that in Europe. A lot of newspapers in Europe didn't even bother to report on the stock market crash when it first happened because they regarded it as an American event, but their economies were actually quite closely connected, integrated with America, and thus the rest of Europe was also swept into the Great Depression of the 30s. Britain suffered not as badly as some other countries, not as badly as Germany, for instance, but nonetheless got caught up in these depression conditions that lasted for 10 years. The Great Depression was a 10-year period defined by high unemployment, banking collapses, business failures, and social malaise across Europe. There you see a hunger march in Britain. Important thing here, paltry unemployment benefits at this time. There wasn't really much of anything in a significant social welfare state that existed in this era. You think about rapid declines in the economies during COVID, for instance. Well, if industries have to lay off a lot of people all at once, might be an expectation that the state can intervene, at least temporarily, to take care of people who have been thrown out of their jobs. Well, there really wasn't much of that in the 30s. I mean, if you lose your job at this time, you're just flat out of luck, which is basically became the condition for numerous people, a large percentage of the population. The environment became a hotbed for political extremism, greatly weakening the existing democracies. There's an old story as well. During very dire conditions, you tend to see this polarization and extremism in political thought, mainly because people are just looking for solutions and they don't believe in the existing system. Their belief or their faith in the existing social order gets lower and lower as conditions worsen. And so there's this idea of, well, desperate sicknesses require desperate remedies. Clearly, we need a different direction. What you see happening in Europe is this political polarization between the left and the right, and you see the growth of not just support for communism, extreme left-wing ideology, but also fascism, which is an extreme right-wing ideology as well. The paragon of fascism would become that individual, Adolf Hitler, who was the person who famously became the dictator Führer of Germany in 1933. Now, there must be something very fitting and kind of almost inevitable about this, because here we have an individual who become the kind of personification, the kind of embodiment of the evil of modern society in kind of colloquial terms. This kind of satanic figure who represents all the evils of modern imperialism and industrial society, draconian, horrible tyrant, and yet who was he really underneath it all? Well, I mean, if you wanted to summarize, you could say he was an anonymous soldier from the First World War. Someone who was not born into a prominent family, not really given a lot in the way of advantages when he was younger. No, just a typical citizen in one of these countries, poor, with really out a lot in the way of prospects and hopes. And prior to the war, he had led a directionless and totally anonymous life of dissipation as a starving artist in Vienna and Munich. He was interested in visual art, applied to academy, did not get in, interested in architecture and classical music as well. In fact, he didn't even seem to show much interest in politics prior to the First World War. It didn't really kind of register as a big thing in his mind. The First World War sculpted him and shaped him as a person, certainly shaped his beliefs and ideas. He, like so many others, seemed to find a sense of a purpose and structure and camaraderie fighting in the war, a sense of a higher cause which included not just him, but all the people around him. Now, for someone like him, who never really formed close relationships with the people around him, must have been stronger and even more acute than that, a sense of kind of belonging with other individuals. But he was also sculpted by the carnage and the destruction, the devastation of the war as well. The perspective, the idea that life is just this endless struggle, this battle for survival. And just over there, across the horizon, there's an enemy from another country who's going to shoot you the first chance you get. Or when you lead a group of soldiers into battle, a platoon, you can expect something like 60% of those people to be killed just in one single battle. Those were the kinds of things that happened in the First World War. Living constantly in those conditions of warfare, destruction, fear, and threat, enough to certainly shape or mold this kind of view that he had. It became a sort of other version of imperialism. Not imperialism based on some kind of civilizing and moralizing project, but no, just imperialism based on conquest and destruction. This kind of might is right mentality. You have to kill them or they'll kill you. That's the kind of perspective that seemed to come out of this war. And I think we would say that for anyone who studies his life, you want to say where he came from, what his perspective was. First World War, that was the biggest factor in shaping him as an individual. See the 1933 German election. Well, actually, let's take the break right now. We'll take the break now, come back in 10 minutes, and look at the rest of this.